She was the woman no one would marry, too proud, too poor, too inconvenient for New York's glittering elite. He was the railroad tycoon who built an empire on steel and ambition, a self-made man that old money whispered about behind closed doors. Their marriage was supposed to be a transaction, cold as the contracts he signed daily. 2 years of pretense in exchange for survival. No emotion, no complications, no love. But in the dangerous world of Gilded Age America, where fortunes rise and fall with a single scandal, where society's judgment can destroy empires overnight, some agreements become devastatingly real, and some hearts refuse to follow the rules. This is the story of an impossible bargain that changed everything. Before we begin, tell me, where are you joining us from today? Drop a comment below, and let's embark on this journey through passion, scandal, and the transformative power of unexpected love. New York City, March 1883. The parlor of the Thornton brownstone on 23rd Street had seen better days, though Margaret Adelaide Thornton worked tirelessly to maintain the illusion of gentility. The Persian rug, though faded, remained free of stains. The mahogany furniture, inherited from her grandfather's prosperous years, gleamed with fresh polish. The velvet curtains, carefully mended where the fabric had worn thin, hung straight and proud against windows that looked out onto a street where prosperity had once been a given, not a distant memory. Margaret sat near the window in the weak afternoon light, her needle moving through the fabric of a morning dress she was altering for the 3rd time. The black bombazine had been her mother's, and before that had belonged to an aunt. There was no money for new dresses, not when the butcher's bill remained unpaid, and the landlord's patience had worn thinner than the elbows of her chemise. At 26, she had become what society whispered about behind gloved hands, a spinster, a woman who had refused 3 perfectly acceptable proposals and now paid the price of her independence. Her mother's illness had consumed 5 years, every penny of the family's dwindling fortune, and any hope Margaret might have harbored for a future beyond these walls. The knock at the door startled her, the needle pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. She pressed it against the black fabric where it would not show, and rose to answer, as they had let their last servant go 3 months prior. The man who stood on her doorstep commanded attention with the same authority that a cathedral commanded reverence. He was tall, powerfully built, dressed in a suit that cost more than Margaret's house had once been worth. His dark hair showed distinguished silver at the temples, and his eyes, a deep, penetrating blue, assessed her with the calculating gaze of a man accustomed to evaluating assets and liabilities. "Miss Thornton," he said, his voice a rich baritone that carried the faint trace of rough origins carefully smoothed away. "I am Nathaniel Blackwood. May I come in?" Margaret knew the name, as did anyone who read the newspapers. Nathaniel Blackwood had built a railroad empire from nothing, connecting the eastern cities to the western territories with lines of steel and ambition. He was feared in boardrooms, envied by rivals, and courted by society matrons with unmarried daughters. What business could such a man possibly have with her? "I don't believe we have an appointment, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice steady despite her confusion. "We don't." He glanced past her into the shabby parlor with eyes that seemed to calculate the value of every stick of furniture. "But I have a proposition that requires privacy. I assure you, Miss Thornton, my intentions are entirely honorable, if unorthodox." Against her better judgment, or perhaps because she had so little left to lose, Margaret stepped aside and allowed him entry. He moved through her home with the confidence of ownership, choosing the best chair without invitation, his presence somehow making the room seem smaller and shabbier than it had moments before. "I will be direct," Nathaniel said once she had seated herself across from him, her hands folded in her lap to hide their trembling. "I need a wife." The bluntness of the statement left Margaret momentarily speechless. She had prepared herself for many possibilities, a charitable offer of employment, perhaps, or news of some forgotten inheritance. This she had not anticipated. "Then I suggest you consult a matchmaker, Mr. Blackwood. I am not in the business of marital arrangements. I don't want a conventional marriage." He leaned forward, his gaze intense. "I need a woman of good family, educated, capable of navigating society with grace. In exchange, I offer financial security, social position, and a life of comfort in my Fifth Avenue mansion." The marriage would be one of convenience, a business arrangement, nothing more. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks, anger mixing with humiliation. "You mistake me for someone desperate enough to sell herself. I mistake you for someone intelligent enough to recognize an opportunity." His voice remained calm, maddeningly reasonable. "You're drowning, Miss Thornton. The bills pile up, the creditors circle, and soon you'll have nothing left but pride, a poor currency to spend when you're hungry and homeless." The truth of his words stung more than any insult. Margaret rose from her chair, her spine rigid with wounded dignity. "I believe our conversation is finished, Mr. Blackwood. Please leave." Before he could respond, another knock sounded at the door, harder, more insistent. Margaret opened it to find a court official, his face impassive as he handed her an envelope bearing the seal of the city marshal. "Notice of eviction, miss. You have 30 days to vacate the premises or settle the outstanding debts." He tipped his hat and departed, leaving Margaret standing with the document in her shaking hands. She turned back to find Nathaniel still seated, his expression unchanged. He had known this was coming, she realized. He had timed his visit to coincide with her moment of greatest desperation. "How dare you?" she whispered, fury and fear warring in her chest. "I dare because I understand necessity." He stood, moving toward her with measured steps. "I built my fortune from nothing, Miss Thornton. I know what it means to face impossible choices. This is not charity I'm offering. It's a mutually beneficial arrangement." "What could you possibly gain from marrying a woman with no fortune, no connections, no—" "Respectability," he interrupted. "Old money trusts old names, even when the fortune is gone. Your lineage opens doors that my money alone cannot. I need a wife who won't expect love, won't demand affection, won't complicate business with emotion. In return, I'll settle every debt you owe, provide you with clothing, jewels, servants, and a position in society that will make those who pitied you burn with envy." Margaret walked to the window, staring out at the street where her mother used to take the air on better days. Pride warred with practicality, and she hated herself for even considering his proposition. "For how long?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "I beg your pardon." She turned to face him, lifting her chin with the remnants of her dignity. "If I agree to this arrangement, for how long would the marriage last?" Something flickered in Nathaniel's eyes, surprise, perhaps, or respect. 2 years, after which, if you wish to dissolve the marriage, I will provide you with a settlement sufficient to ensure your independence for life. You'll have your freedom and the means to enjoy it. 2 years. 2 years of playing a role, of living a lie, of being the wife in name to a man who viewed her as a business acquisition. But at the end, true independence, the one thing she had sacrificed everything to preserve, now offered on a silver platter. "I have conditions," Margaret said, her heart pounding. "Name them." "The marriage remains unconsummated. Separate bedrooms, separate lives outside of public appearances. And I want legal documentation of our agreement, signed and witnessed, ensuring the settlement you've promised." Nathaniel crossed the room with 3 long strides, extending his hand. "Agreed. Do we have a deal, Miss Thornton?" Margaret looked at his outstretched hand, at the strong fingers and calloused palm that belied his current wealth. She thought of her mother's grave, barely marked because she couldn't afford a proper stone. She thought of the empty larder, the cold fireplace, the mounting debts. She thought of growing old alone in a furnished room, working as a paid companion to women who had once been her equals. She placed her hand in his. "We have a deal, Mr. Blackwood." His grip was firm, warm, sending an unexpected jolt through her arm. For just a moment their eyes met, and Margaret saw something in his gaze that made her wonder if this arrangement might prove more complicated than either of them anticipated. "I'll send my attorney tomorrow to handle the paperwork," Nathaniel said, releasing her hand. "And my housekeeper will call the day after to begin preparations. We'll marry quietly in 1 week, then announce it at the Vanderbilt ball the following month. That gives you time to adjust and be properly outfitted." He moved toward the door, then paused, looking back at her standing alone in her shabby parlor with her mended dress and proud bearing. "You won't regret this, Miss Thornton." After he left, Margaret sank into her chair, her legs no longer able to support her. She had just agreed to marry a man she didn't know, to live a lie for 2 years, to trade her principles for security. And yet, as she looked around the room that would soon no longer be hers, at the life that had been slowly suffocating her, she felt something unexpected stirring beneath the fear and uncertainty. Hope. Perhaps even the faintest whisper of possibility. The Blackwood mansion on Fifth Avenue stood like a monument to ambition realized, built of gleaming white marble with a facade that borrowed shamelessly from French Renaissance palaces. It rose 5 stories above the street, its windows tall and numerous as accusing eyes. Margaret climbed the front steps with her few belongings packed in a borrowed trunk, feeling like an imposter about to be exposed. The entrance hall alone was larger than the entire parlor of her former home. Black and white marble checkerboard floors stretched toward a magnificent staircase that curved upward beneath a chandelier dripping with crystal prisms. Gilt-framed mirrors multiplied the grandeur, and Margaret caught glimpses of herself, small, shabby, utterly out of place in this temple of wealth. "Mrs. Blackwood will be staying in the Rose Suite," Nathaniel instructed the housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. Morrison, whose iron-grey hair and rigid posture suggested she ran the household with military precision. "See that she has everything she requires." "Of course, sir." Mrs. Morrison's gaze swept over Margaret with professional assessment, noting every worn seam and outdated styling. "Will Madame require assistance dressing? A lady's maid will be hired," Nathaniel said before Margaret could respond, "and I've arranged for Madame Celeste to call this afternoon with her assistants. Miss Thornton," he corrected himself, "Mrs. Blackwood requires an entirely new wardrobe." Margaret found her voice. "That's hardly necessary. You can appear at my side, dressed as befits your position, or we can terminate our arrangement now." His tone remained pleasant, but steel underlay the words. "Those are your options." Pride surged through Margaret, the instinct to refuse burning on her tongue. But she had made her choice, signed the papers his attorney had presented. She was now, at least legally, Mrs. Nathaniel Blackwood. "As you wish," she said, the words tasting of ashes. The Rose Suite occupied an entire corner of the 3rd floor. The bedroom alone dwarfed her former home, decorated in shades of cream and dusty rose with silk wallpaper depicting delicate cherry blossoms. An enormous 4-poster bed dominated the space, dressed in linens so fine Margaret feared touching them with her rough hands. French doors opened onto a private balcony overlooking the gardens below. "Your sitting room is through there." Mrs. Morrison indicated another door. "The dressing room beyond. Your bathroom has been fitted with the latest plumbing, hot water at all hours. If you require anything, pull the bell cord. A maid will respond immediately." When Margaret was finally alone, she sank onto the edge of a velvet chaise, overwhelmed by the sudden transformation of her circumstances. Yesterday she had been counting pennies, wondering how to stretch a half loaf of bread. Today, she stood in a room that represented more wealth than her family had possessed in 3 generations. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Nathaniel entered without waiting for permission, and Margaret rose instinctively, some ingrained propriety demanding she stand in his presence. "I wanted to discuss expectations before Madame Celeste arrives," he said, remaining near the door with hands clasped behind his back. In the afternoon light streaming through the windows, Margaret noticed details she had missed during their first meeting. The small scar above his left eyebrow, the slight crook in his nose, suggesting it had once been broken the way his expensive suit couldn't quite disguise the powerful build of a man accustomed to physical labor. "I expect you'll tell me how to dress, how to speak, how to breathe," Margaret said, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. "I expect you to be yourself." The response surprised her. "Society is full of vapid beauties and calculating debutantes. You offer something different, intelligence, dignity, genuine breeding that no amount of money can purchase. I don't need you to pretend to be something you're not. I need you to remember what you are." "And what am I, Mr. Blackwood?" "A lady." He moved further into the room, his presence somehow making the vast space feel intimate. "The granddaughter of Commodore Thornton, whose ships once dominated Atlantic trade. A woman educated in literature, music and art, when most girls were taught only to simper and spend their husbands' fortunes. You may have lost your money, Miss Thornton, but you never lost your worth. That's what I'm purchasing." The word purchasing made Margaret flinch, but before she could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. Madame Celeste had arrived with a retinue of assistants carrying trunks of fabric samples, fashion plates and measuring tools. For the next 4 hours, Margaret endured the peculiar torture of being treated as a dress form. Madame Celeste, a tiny Frenchwoman with sharp eyes and sharper opinions, circled her with pins protruding from her mouth, calling out measurements in rapid French to her assistants. "The figure is good," she declared in heavily accented English. "Too thin, perhaps, but we remedy this with proper feeding, no? The colouring, excellent. Not the insipid pink of these silly girls, but something with depth, rich colours, jewel tones. Emerald to match the eyes, sapphire to contrast, burgundy for evening." Margaret stood on a raised platform in her chemise and petticoats, arms extended, while fabric after fabric was draped across her shoulders. Nathaniel had excused himself, but returned periodically to approve selections, his presence making Margaret acutely aware of her undressed state, despite the layers of undergarments. "The green silk," he said during one such appearance, gesturing to a bolt of emerald fabric shot through with gold thread, "and the burgundy velvet for the opera gown. Excellent taste, Monsieur Blackwood." Madame Celeste beamed. "You have the eye for what flatters." "I have the eye for investments that provide proper returns," he corrected, but his gaze lingered on Margaret in a way that made heat rise to her cheeks. When Madame Celeste finally departed with promises to return in 3 days for initial fittings, Margaret collapsed into a chair, exhausted. "Tomorrow morning, Professor Hartley will arrive to discuss proper etiquette for various social situations," Nathaniel informed her. "In the afternoon, you'll practice dancing with Monsieur Philippe. Evening meals will be taken together in the dining room so you can become accustomed to formal service." "Am I a wife or a project?" The words escaped before Margaret could stop them. Nathaniel paused in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You're a partner in an enterprise. Every successful venture requires preparation. I built my fortune through attention to detail and thorough planning. I don't intend to fail now." That night, Margaret dined alone at a table that could seat 20. Course after course arrived: consommé, fish and cream sauce, roasted duck, vegetables she couldn't name, elaborate desserts. She ate mechanically, tasting nothing, painfully aware of the empty chair at the table's head where her husband in name had chosen not to sit. The following days passed in a blur of instruction. Professor Hartley, an elderly gentleman with exacting standards, drilled her on the Byzantine rules of New York society. who took precedence in entering a room, proper forms of address for various ranks, which topics could be discussed in mixed company and which could not. Monsieur Philippe, a temperamental dance master, corrected her posture with sharp raps of his cane until Margaret's shoulders ached from holding them back properly. Through it all, Nathaniel appeared and disappeared like a ghost in his own home. Sometimes she would catch him watching her practice the quadrille, his expression inscrutable. Other times she would descend for breakfast to find him already gone, departed for his offices downtown before dawn. 3 evenings before their first public appearance together, an intimate dinner with 6 of Nathaniel's business associates, Margaret found him in the library. He stood before the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring into the flames. "May I speak with you?" she asked from the doorway. He turned, surprise flickering across his features. "Of course. This is your home now." Margaret entered but remained near the door, suddenly uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for the clothes, the instruction, all of it. I know I haven't been gracious about this arrangement. You've been honest. I prefer that to false gratitude." He took a drink, watching her over the rim of his glass. "You're afraid?" It wasn't a question, but Margaret answered anyway. "Terrified. What if I fail? What if I embarrass you in front of your associates? What if they see through this arrangement?" Nathaniel set down his glass and crossed the room until only a few feet separated them. This close, Margaret could smell the whiskey on his breath, the scent of expensive soap and something uniquely him, sandalwood and leather and ambition made flesh. They will see a woman of breeding and intelligence married to a man of means. Nothing more, nothing less. His voice had gentled. "You won't fail, Margaret. Failure isn't in your nature. You're too stubborn for that." The use of her given name sent an unexpected warmth through her chest. "You seem very certain." "I am." He reached out, and for one suspended moment Margaret thought he might touch her face. Instead, his hand dropped to his side. "You refused 3 proposals because you wouldn't settle for less than you deserved. You nursed your mother through a long illness when you could have abandoned her to hired nurses. You're standing here now, facing your fears instead of hiding from them. That's not the behavior of someone who fails." Margaret found herself moving closer, drawn by something in his voice, in his eyes. "Why me, Nathaniel? Truly, you could have chosen any number of impoverished gentlewomen desperate for rescue. Because you're not desperate for rescue. You're desperate for autonomy." He smiled slightly, a genuine expression that transformed his usually stern features. "Because you looked me in the eye and negotiated terms instead of swooning with gratitude. Because beneath that prickly pride, you have the steel necessary to be my equal, even if you don't see it yet. Equal." The word hung between them, fraught with implications neither had anticipated when signing their agreement. "I should retire," Margaret said, though she made no move to leave. "Tomorrow is the dinner. Tomorrow is just the beginning." Nathaniel took a step back, restoring proper distance. "Sleep well, Mrs. Blackwood." In her rose suite, Margaret lay awake long into the night, replaying their conversation. She had entered this arrangement expecting coldness, indifference, a purely transactional relationship. Instead, she found herself drawn to the man behind the fortune, curious about the boy from 5 Points who had clawed his way to Fifth Avenue. Dangerous thoughts for a woman who had promised herself she would keep her heart safely locked away for 2 years. But as sleep finally claimed her, Margaret's last conscious thought was of Nathaniel's eyes when he called her his equal. Warm, intense, and entirely too compelling for her own good. The Pierce mansion blazed with light, every window illuminated like a jewel box on display. Carriages lined the circular drive, depositing New York's elite in their finest evening dress. Margaret sat beside Nathaniel in their coach, her hands clenched in the folds of her new gown, the emerald silk that Madame Celeste had promised would be devastating. "Breathe," Nathaniel murmured, placing his gloved hand over hers. "You look magnificent." Margaret did breathe, drawing in air that seemed too thick to fill her lungs. The gown was indeed magnificent, emerald silk with a daringly low neckline, trimmed with gold embroidery and seed pearls that caught the light with her every movement. Her hair had been arranged in an elaborate style by her new lady's maid, and around her throat lay an emerald necklace from Nathaniel's vault that was worth more than her family home had been. She was a vision of wealth and elegance, and she felt like a complete fraud. The carriage halted. A footman opened the door and extended his hand to assist Margaret's descent. As she stepped onto the red carpet leading to the mansion's entrance, she became acutely aware of eyes turning her direction, whispers beginning to circulate. Nathaniel appeared at her side, offering his arm. In white tie and tails, with diamond studs winking at his collar, he looked every inch the powerful Tycoon. "Stay close to me," he instructed quietly. "Answer questions briefly and graciously. If anyone becomes impertinent, I'll handle them." They entered together into a world of glittering excess. The Pierce ballroom had been transformed into a winter garden, with hothouse flowers cascading from every surface and a full orchestra playing Strauss. Women in gowns worth small fortunes circulated on the arms of men whose names appeared in the society pages and financial columns with equal frequency. Blackwood, a portly gentleman with impressive mutton-chop whiskers, approached. "So the rumors are true. You've finally taken a wife." "Indeed. May I present Mrs. Margaret Blackwood? My dear, this is Cornelius Vandermeer, president of the Metropolitan Club." Margaret executed the curtsy that Monsieur Philippe had drilled into her, keeping her eyes properly downcast. "Mr. Vandermeer, what a pleasure." "Thornton, did you say?" Vandermeer's bushy eyebrows rose. "Any relation to Commodore Thornton?" "His granddaughter, sir." The older man's entire demeanor shifted, suspicion replaced by approval. "Ah, I sailed on your grandfather's ships as a young man, finest vessels on the Atlantic. Your father?" "Passed 10 years ago, sir." "And your mother recently, I understand. My condolences." He turned to Nathaniel with newfound respect. "You've done well for yourself, Blackwood. The Thorntons are genuine old stock." As Vandermeer moved away, Margaret felt Nathaniel's hand tighten on her arm. Approval or relief, she couldn't tell. But before she could speak, a vision in white approached, golden hair piled high, blue eyes cold despite her smile. "Nathaniel." The woman's voice was honey over ice. "You didn't tell me you'd married. How unexpected." "Vivienne." Nathaniel's tone held no warmth. "May I present my wife, Margaret? This is Miss Vivienne Ashford." Up close, Vivienne Ashford was breathtakingly beautiful, porcelain skin, perfect features, a figure that the Worth gown she wore displayed to stunning advantage. She looked at Margaret the way one might examine an inferior piece of merchandise. "Mrs. Blackwood, how quaint your gown is. Madame Celeste's work, I presume. She does have a tendency toward the provincial." Vivienne's smile never reached her eyes. "Tell me, where exactly did Nathaniel find you? I thought I knew all the eligible young ladies in New York society." "Miss Thornton has been caring for her mother during her final illness," Nathaniel said, before Margaret could respond. "A duty that required her to withdraw from society temporarily. How very devoted." Vivienne's gaze swept Margaret from head to toe. Though one must wonder what prompted such a hasty marriage, one hopes there isn't a pressing reason for the speed. The implication hung in the air, toxic as arsenic. Around them conversations had quieted, ears straining to hear the exchange. Margaret felt heat flooding her cheeks, anger rising. But before she could formulate a response that wouldn't confirm Vivienne's insinuations, a sharp voice cut through the tension. "Vivienne Ashford, your breeding is showing, and it's quite as common as everyone suspected." An elderly woman in purple silk materialized at Margaret's elbow. Mrs. Eleanor Prescott, Margaret's former neighbor, smiled with the fierce loyalty of true friendship. "Mrs. Prescott," Margaret breathed, gratitude overwhelming her. "Don't think I would miss your debut, dear girl. As for you, Miss Ashford..." Eleanor's smile turned predatory. Questioning the virtue of a Thornton is unwise. Margaret's lineage was impeccable when your grandfather was still selling fish at the harbour market. Now run along before I'm forced to educate you on the difference between breeding and mere wealth. Vivienne's perfect complexion mottled with fury. She shot Nathaniel a look of pure venom before sweeping away, her white gown trailing dramatically. "Eleanor, you are magnificent," Margaret said, squeezing the older woman's hand. "Nonsense, that little blonde viper needed taking down." Eleanor studied Nathaniel with shrewd eyes. "So you're the railroad tycoon who's captured our Margaret's heart. Treat her well, young man, or you'll answer to me." "I assure you, Mrs. Prescott, I have only Margaret's best interests at heart," Nathaniel replied smoothly. After Eleanor departed to terrorize other social climbers, Nathaniel led Margaret to the dance floor. The orchestra had begun a waltz, and he drew her into his arms with practiced ease. "You handled that well," he said as they began to move. "I handled nothing. Eleanor rescued me." Margaret followed his lead, grateful for Monsieur Philippe's brutal instruction. "That woman despises me." "Vivienne despises anyone she perceives as competition. She had designs on becoming Mrs. Blackwood herself." Margaret looked up at him in surprise. "Were you engaged?" "Hardly. I attended 3 social functions as her escort, and she assumed I would propose. When I didn't, she became persistent." Nathaniel's hand tightened at Margaret's waist, pulling her infinitesimally closer. "You need not worry about Vivienne Ashford." But Margaret was worried. She had seen the fury in those cold blue eyes, the wounded pride beneath the beautiful facade. Vivienne was a woman scorned, and such women were dangerous. The waltz continued, and Margaret became aware of other sensations. The strength in Nathaniel's arms, the way he guided her effortlessly through the turns, the scent of his cologne mixing with something uniquely him. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You truly do look magnificent tonight," he said quietly, his voice for her alone. "Every man in this room envies me. Because I'm wearing a small fortune in emeralds? Because you're wearing honesty and intelligence like other women wear jewels, and it's infinitely more valuable?" His eyes held hers, and for a moment the crowded ballroom faded away. "I chose well, Margaret Thornton." The waltz ended, and propriety demanded they separate. But as Nathaniel escorted her from the floor, Margaret felt something shifting between them, the careful boundaries of their arrangement beginning to blur. The rest of the evening passed in a whirl of introductions, brief conversations, and careful navigation of social minefields. Margaret met railroad magnates and their wives, old money families whose approval could make or break Nathaniel's social aspirations, younger couples whose friendship might prove valuable. Through it all, she remained acutely aware of 2 things: Vivienne Ashford watching from across the room with murder in her eyes, and Nathaniel's hand at the small of her back, possessive and protective in equal measure. Near midnight, Margaret excused herself to the ladies' retiring room. She needed a moment away from the scrutiny, the forced smiles, the constant performance. She stood before the mirror, studying the woman reflected there, elegant, composed, seemingly confident, a stranger wearing her face. "Enjoying your triumph?" Margaret turned to find Vivienne standing in the doorway, her beautiful face twisted with spite. "I'm not sure what you mean, Miss Ashford. Playing the innocent won't work with me." Vivienne glided forward, her white gown seeming to glow in the gaslight. "I know exactly what you are, a desperate woman who trapped Nathaniel into marriage. Did you compromise yourself deliberately, or was it merely fortunate timing? How I came to marry Nathaniel is none of your concern." "Everything about Nathaniel concerns me." Vivienne's voice dropped to a venomous whisper. "We had an understanding. He was mine until you appeared with your sad story and empty bank account. Then perhaps you should have secured his proposal before assuming his intentions." Margaret held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "Now, if you'll excuse me..." Vivienne's hand shot out, gripping Margaret's wrist with surprising strength. Listen carefully, Mrs. Blackwood. I will discover whatever secret brought about this hasty marriage, and when I do, I will destroy you so thoroughly that even Nathaniel's fortune won't save you. Is that a threat? It's a promise. Vivienne released her and stepped back, her smile returning as other women entered the retiring room. Such a lovely evening, isn't it? I do hope you and Nathaniel will be very happy together, for however long it lasts. She swept out, leaving Margaret shaken and furious. When she finally composed herself enough to return to the ballroom, she found Nathaniel deep in conversation with a man she recognized from newspaper illustrations, Thomas Whitmore, another railroad tycoon and Nathaniel's chief business rival. Ah, here she is. Nathaniel drew Margaret close. My dear, you remember Thomas Whitmore? Mrs. Blackwood. Whitmore's bow was correct, but his smile didn't reach his grey eyes. What an unexpected pleasure! I had heard rumours of Nathaniel's marriage, but assumed they were merely that, rumours. He's always been so focused on business rather than domestic concerns. A man's priorities can change, Nathaniel said smoothly. Indeed. Whitmore's gaze lingered on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. One wonders what prompted such a sudden shift. Marriage is quite the commitment, especially for someone as careful as yourself, Nathaniel. Sometimes the right person appears when you least expect it, Margaret interjected, keeping her voice steady despite her growing unease. I consider myself fortunate. As do I. Nathaniel's arms slipped around her waist, and Margaret leaned into him instinctively. To any observer, they appeared every inch the devoted couple. After Whitmore departed, Nathaniel's expression darkened. Stay away from that man. He's dangerous. More dangerous than Miss Ashford. Infinitely. Vivienne is a spoiled socialite with wounded pride. Whitmore is a businessman with no conscience and considerable resources. He's been trying to destroy me for years. Before Margaret could ask why, the orchestra struck up another waltz. Nathaniel led her back to the floor, and this time when he pulled her close, it felt less like social performance and more like protection. As they danced, Margaret noticed Whitmore watching from the sidelines, his expression calculating. And near the refreshment table, Vivienne stood in deep conversation with a thin man in an expensive but ill-fitting suit, both of them staring at Margaret and Nathaniel with unmistakable intent. The evening that should have marked their triumph suddenly felt like the opening move in a game Margaret didn't yet understand, a game where the stakes were far higher than she had imagined when she agreed to Nathaniel's proposition. On the carriage ride home, Nathaniel was silent, staring out the window at the darkened streets. Margaret wanted to ask what troubled him, what history existed between him and Whitmore, what dangers lurked beneath the glittering surface of their new life. But when she looked at his profile in the dim light, strong, determined, and suddenly vulnerable in a way she'd never seen, the questions died on her lips. Instead, she simply said, "Thank you for tonight." He turned to her, surprise evident. For what? For defending me, for not treating me as merely an acquisition, for making me feel less alone in that room full of strangers. Something shifted in his expression. His hand found hers in the darkness between them, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "You're not alone, Margaret. Whatever comes next, we face it together." The promise should have brought comfort. Instead, it filled Margaret with a different kind of fear, the terrifying possibility that this arrangement might become something neither of them had bargained for, something real. Margaret woke to sunlight streaming through her bedroom windows and the sound of urgent voices in the hallway. She pulled on her robe and opened the door to find Nathaniel in his shirt sleeves, unusual for a man who maintained such rigid formality, engaged in heated conversation with a nervous-looking clerk. "I don't care what excuse he's offering. Tell him I won't pay." Nathaniel's voice was cold steel. "Now get out." The clerk scurried past Margaret without meeting her eyes. Nathaniel turned, noticing her for the first time, and his expression shifted from fury to carefully controlled neutrality. "Forgive the disturbance. Business matter." "At 7 in the morning?" Margaret moved closer, noting the tension in his jaw, the shadows under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept poorly. "Nathaniel, what's happening?" "Nothing that concerns you." The dismissal stung. Margaret drew herself up, meeting his gaze directly. "We made an agreement that I would play my part convincingly. How can I do that if you keep me ignorant of threats to our arrangement?" For a long moment he simply stared at her, then abruptly he gestured toward his study. "Get dressed. Join me in 20 minutes. It's time you understood what you've married into." "No." 20 minutes later, Margaret sat across from Nathaniel in his study, a room she'd never been invited to enter. Dark wood paneling, leather furniture, walls lined with books on commerce and engineering. A man's domain, smelling of cigars and ambition. Nathaniel stood by the window, his back to her. "What do you know about my origins?" "Very little. The newspapers say you built the Hudson Valley Railroad from nothing. The newspapers lie." He turned to face her. "My father was Patrick Blackwood, a track layer for the Erie Railroad. He died in an accident when I was 14, crushed beneath a derailed freight car. The company called it an act of God, and paid my mother nothing." Margaret remained silent, sensing he needed to tell this story uninterrupted. "I was pulled from school to work. Started as a water boy, carrying buckets to the crews. Worked my way up to track layer, then foreman. I was 22 when I discovered why my father died." His hands clenched into fists. Thomas Whitmore owned the company that supplied the rails. He'd been delivering substandard materials, pocketing the difference. The rails were faulty. Everyone knew it. But complaining meant losing your job, and men with families couldn't afford principals. "My God," Margaret whispered. "I confronted Whitmore. He laughed in my face, told me my father was a drunk who'd probably been at fault anyway." Nathaniel's voice remained steady, but his eyes burned. "So I set out to destroy him. Spent 10 years learning every aspect of the railroad business, saved every penny, made deals, took risks that should have killed me. When I finally had enough capital, I started building my own line. Better rails, better safety, better pay for workers. I undercut Whitmore's prices until his company began to hemorrhage money." "That's not criminal," Margaret said. "That's competition." "No." Nathaniel moved to his desk, pulling out a folder thick with documents. "But this is. In my determination to ruin Whitmore, I made deals with men I shouldn't have trusted, forged a few signatures I shouldn't have forged, paid bribes to city officials to secure right-of-way permits. Nothing violent, nothing that hurt ordinary workers, but enough to land me in prison if the right prosecutor took interest. And Whitmore has evidence of this? He claims to. 2 days ago, I received a letter demanding I transfer 20% of my company shares to him, or he'll deliver his evidence to the authorities." Nathaniel sank into his chair, suddenly looking exhausted. "That's why I needed to marry quickly. A respectable wife from an old family provides social armor. It makes me harder to attack, more sympathetic to society if accusations emerge." Margaret absorbed this, her mind racing. "So I'm not just a social asset. I'm a shield." "Yes." He met her eyes without flinching. "I won't apologize for that. You needed rescue from destitution. I needed protection from my past. Our arrangement serves both purposes." The brutal honesty should have angered her. Instead, Margaret felt an unexpected kinship with this man who had clawed his way up from poverty, who had sacrificed his principles for justice, who now faced ruin for sins committed in service of a righteous cause. What does Whitmore want beyond the shares? My destruction. I cost him millions and his reputation. He won't stop until I'm broken. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. The morning visit you interrupted, that was his latest messenger, demanding an answer by week's end. Margaret stood, moving to the desk where the incriminating documents lay. She picked up one page, scanning the contents. A contract with signatures that didn't quite match, dates that had been altered. Sloppy work for a man usually so meticulous. "These could be forgeries themselves," she said slowly. "Has anyone authenticated them? I haven't seen the originals. Whitmore sent copies. Then we need to see the originals. If they're forgeries, we expose him. If they're real, we find leverage of our own. Margaret looked up, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. You said you wouldn't apologize for using me as a shield. I won't apologize for refusing to be merely decorative. If we're partners in this arrangement, then let me be a partner in truth. Nathaniel stared at her, as though seeing her for the first time. You would help me, even knowing what I've done? What you've done is seek justice for your father and better conditions for working men. The methods may have been questionable, but the intent was honorable. Margaret set down the document. Besides, if you're destroyed, so am I. Our fates are bound now, for better or worse. Something flickered in Nathaniel's expression. Gratitude, respect, and something warmer that made Margaret's pulse quicken. There may be a way, he said slowly. Whitmore hosts a gathering next week. Old railroad men, investors, politicians. If we could access his study during the event, then I could search for the originals while you keep him occupied. Margaret nodded. It's risky, but possible. Absolutely not. Nathaniel stood abruptly. I won't put you in danger. I'm already in danger. If Whitmore destroys you, my reputation crumbles with yours. At least this way, I'm taking action rather than waiting for catastrophe. She moved around the desk, facing him across its polished surface. You said I wasn't alone, that we'd face whatever comes together. Were those empty words? No. The admission seemed torn from him. But Margaret, if you're caught, I won't be. I've spent years being invisible in society, the spinster nobody notices. That's an advantage now. She smiled slightly. Besides, I'm far more clever than Whitmore will expect. He'll see a decorative wife, not a threat. Nathaniel circled the desk until he stood directly before her. This close, Margaret could see the flecks of lighter blue in his dark eyes, the faint lines that bracketed his mouth. He reached out, his fingers grazing her cheek in a gesture so gentle it made her breath catch. You're remarkable, he said quietly. I chose you for your name and breeding, but you're so much more than that. As are you more than your fortune. The words emerged as a whisper. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Nathaniel's hand moved to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. She should step back, maintain the boundaries they'd established. This was an arrangement, not a romance. But when Nathaniel lowered his head, when his lips brushed hers with tentative question, Margaret didn't pull away. Instead, she rose on her toes, meeting him halfway in a kiss that shattered every careful rule they'd constructed. His arms came around her, pulling her close. Margaret's hands found his shoulders, then his hair, threading through the dark strands. The kiss deepened, becoming something fierce and desperate. Months of tension and denied attraction finally given voice. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. This wasn't part of our agreement. No. Margaret's hands remained tangled in his hair. It wasn't. We should forget this happened, maintain professional distance. We should. Neither moved. Nathaniel's thumb traced her lower lip, his eyes dark with desire. Margaret, A sharp knock at the study door made them spring apart. Mrs. Morrison entered without waiting for permission, her expression disapproving. Pardon the interruption, sir, but you have visitors. Mr. Vandermeer and his wife request the pleasure of calling on you and Mrs. Blackwood. Nathaniel straightened his collar, composure sliding back into place with practiced ease. Tell them we'll receive them in the drawing room in 10 minutes. After Mrs. Morrison departed, he turned back to Margaret. We'll discuss this later. Both the kiss and the plan for Whitmore's gathering. Margaret nodded, not trusting her voice. Her lips still tingled from his kiss, her body still hummed with awareness. She fled to her rooms to make herself presentable, her mind spinning. She had agreed to a loveless arrangement, a business transaction that would end in 2 years with her independence secured. She had not agreed to feel, to want, to lie awake at night thinking about her husband's hands and mouth and the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't watching. But as Margaret changed into a receiving dress and pinned her hair into place, as her fingers trembled with the memory of Nathaniel's touch, she understood with perfect clarity that she was in terrible danger. Not from Whitmore's threats or Vivian's schemes or society's judgment, from her own treacherous heart. The Vandermeers' visit proved less social call than reconnaissance mission. Cornelius questioned Nathaniel about his railroad expansion plans, while his wife, a formidable woman with keen eyes, grilled Margaret about her background, education, and intentions. Young women today often lack proper understanding of wifely duties, Mrs. Vandermeer said over tea, her tone making clear she considered Margaret suspect until proven otherwise. A man in Nathaniel's position requires a wife who understands discretion, loyalty, and the management of a household befitting his status. My mother trained me thoroughly in household management, Margaret replied smoothly, though she had never managed more than 2 servants. And as for loyalty and discretion, I consider them foundational to any successful marriage. Indeed, the older woman's gaze sharpened. Some might question the haste of your marriage. Only 3 weeks between meeting and wedding, I understand. Margaret felt Nathaniel tense beside her, but she maintained her composure. When 2 people recognize they're well-suited, delay serves no purpose. My mourning period had ended, and Nathaniel offered me the opportunity to begin a new chapter. I saw no reason to refuse. How pragmatic. Mrs. Vandermeer set down her teacup with a decisive click. I approve of pragmatism. Too many young girls today have their heads filled with romantic nonsense from novels. After the Vandermeers departed, Cornelius having extracted a promise that Nathaniel would support his railroad bill in the state legislature, Margaret collapsed onto the sofa with unladylike abandon. That woman should work for the Pinkertons. I felt like a criminal under interrogation. Nathaniel laughed, the sound surprising them both. You handled her brilliantly. Eleanor Vandermeer's approval is worth more than a dozen favorable newspaper articles. Then perhaps she'll be useful when Whitmore makes his accusations public. The laughter died. Nathaniel moved to the window, his expression darkening. I've been thinking about your proposal. It's too dangerous. It's necessary. Margaret rose, joining him by the window. Unless you have another plan, I could pay him, transfer the shares, cut my losses. And in 2 years, he'll demand more. Men like Whitmore don't stop once they've discovered your weakness. She touched his arm, drawing his attention. You didn't become successful by surrendering, Nathaniel. Don't start now. Before he could respond, Mrs. Morrison appeared again, this time bearing a silver tray with a single envelope. This just arrived for Mrs. Blackwood, hand-delivered. Margaret opened it, scanning the contents. It's an invitation from Vivian Ashford. She's hosting a ladies' luncheon tomorrow and requests my presence. Refuse. Nathaniel's tone brooked no argument. I can't. 6 other wives will be there, all from families we need to cultivate. Refusing would be an insult. Margaret reread the note, its wording all elaborate courtesy concealing unmistakable command. Besides, perhaps I can learn something useful. Vivian clearly has some agenda. Her agenda is to destroy you. Then I'll have to ensure she fails. Margaret tucked the invitation into her pocket. I'm not a fragile thing that breaks at the first sign of conflict, Nathaniel. Credit me with some resilience. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. I do, but resilience doesn't make you immune to malice. The concern in his voice made Margaret's chest tighten. This man who showed the world only steel and certainty revealed glimpses of tenderness that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The following afternoon, Margaret arrived at the Ashford residence, a limestone mansion that rivaled Nathaniel's for ostentation, if not taste. Vivian greeted her with poisonous sweetness, leading her into a conservatory where 6 other women were already assembled. Ladies, you remember Mrs. Nathaniel Blackwood so recently emerged from obscurity. Vivian's smile could have cut glass. Margaret, darling, you know everyone, I'm sure. Margaret recognized most, wives of railroad investors, shipping magnates, and old money families. Women who would spread gossip faster than telegraph wires carried news. The luncheon proceeded with excruciating slowness. Each course brought fresh opportunities for Vivian to make veiled remarks about hasty marriages, social climbing, and women who trapped wealthy men through various means. Of course, some women are content with loveless arrangements, Vivian said, while servants cleared the fish course. Marriage as mere transaction rather than affection. How terribly sad, don't you think? I think, Margaret said carefully, that every marriage contains elements of practicality. Even love matches must consider compatibility of background, fortune, and temperament. Only children believe passion alone sustains a lifetime together. How very pragmatic, Mrs. Blackwood. This from Mrs. Catherine Sterling, wife of a banking magnate. Though one hopes affection develops eventually, even in arranged matches. Indeed it does, Margaret said, and realized with a jolt that she wasn't lying. Despite her best intentions, despite every warning she'd given herself, affection, or something far more dangerous, was developing between her and Nathaniel. Vivian's eyes narrowed, sensing she'd lost this round. She changed tactics. Speaking of affection, we were just discussing that terrible business with the railroad labor disputes. So many accidents lately. One wonders if someone isn't managing their lines properly. Accidents happen in any industry, Margaret replied. Though I understand Nathaniel's safety record is superior to most competitors. For now, Vivian's smile turned predatory. But reputations can change so quickly. One scandal, one hint of impropriety, and suddenly everything crumbles. Don't you find that frightening, Margaret? How precarious success can be. The threat was unmistakable. Margaret met Vivian's gaze steadily. I find that truth eventually emerges, regardless of attempts to suppress or distort it. Those who build on solid foundations weather storms that destroy houses built on sand. How very philosophical. Vivian signaled for dessert. I do hope your philosophical certainty provides comfort when you need it. As the luncheon finally concluded, Margaret prepared to depart, but Vivian caught her arm in the hallway, her grip surprisingly strong. A word of warning, Mrs. Blackwood. You've stumbled into matters you don't understand. Nathaniel has enemies, powerful ones who won't be satisfied until he's destroyed. As his wife, you'll be destroyed alongside him. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Leave him now, annul the marriage quietly, and I'll ensure you land safely. Stay, and you'll regret it. Margaret pulled free. Is this concern for my welfare, or another attempt at intimidation? It's truth. For just a moment, something genuine flickered in Vivian's eyes. Not kindness, but perhaps a twisted form of honesty. I wanted him, yes. I thought I could manage him, control him, bend him to social acceptability. But I'm not fool enough to go down with his ship. You are. Then I'm a fool who keeps her promises. Margaret adjusted her gloves with deliberate calm. Thank you for the luncheon, Miss Ashford. It was illuminating. She departed before Vivian could respond, her head held high despite her racing heart. Only in the carriage did she allow herself to tremble, the mask of composure slipping. Vivian knew something specific about Whitmore's threats, and her warning, however maliciously delivered, suggested the danger was more immediate than Margaret had realized. When she arrived home, Margaret found Nathaniel in his study with a man she didn't recognize, thin, nervous, with ink-stained fingers, and the hunted look of someone carrying dangerous information. Margaret, Nathaniel stood abruptly. This is Mr. Davies, an investigator I've employed. He's uncovered something concerning. Davies cleared his throat. Mrs. Blackwood, I've been investigating Thomas Whitmore's activities. He's been meeting regularly with Miss Vivian Ashford. They've hired a journalist known for scandalous exposés. I believe they're planning to publish your husband's alleged crimes in the Herald within the week. The room tilted. Margaret gripped the back of a chair. Can we stop publication? Not legally. But if we had evidence of Whitmore's own crimes, the substandard rails, the bribes he's paid, the workers' deaths he's responsible for, we could threaten counter-publication. Mutually assured destruction often motivates silence. Aye, which brings us back to accessing his study during next week's gathering, Margaret said. Nathaniel moved around the desk. No, it's too dangerous. If I'm caught, I'm a silly woman who got lost looking for the powder room. They'll condescend, not accuse. Margaret faced him squarely. You taught me that being underestimated is an advantage. Let me use that advantage now. Davies glanced between them. Forgive my intrusion, but Mrs. Blackwood may be right. A woman searching for documents would raise less suspicion than a man. If discovered, she can claim innocent confusion. See? Margaret smiled despite the fear churning in her stomach. Even your investigator agrees. Nathaniel's jaw worked, frustration and concern warring across his features. Finally, he nodded tersely. On 2 conditions. First, Davies accompanies us to the gathering and monitors the situation. At first sign of trouble, we abandon the plan. Second, he moved closer, his hand cupping her face with unexpected tenderness. Promise me you'll be careful. I couldn't bear it if anything happened to you. The raw emotion in his voice, in his touch, made Margaret's throat tighten. I promise. That night, unable to sleep, Margaret descended to the library where she'd noticed Nathaniel often retreated. She found him there, still dressed, a nearly empty whiskey glass in his hand. Can't sleep either, he asked without turning from the window. Too much to think about. Margaret moved to stand beside him. Outside, Fifth Avenue lay quiet, gaslight casting pools of illumination on cobblestones. Nathaniel, what Vivian said today. She warned me to leave you. Said you had powerful enemies who would destroy me alongside you. She's not wrong. He finally looked at her, his expression raw. Perhaps you should go. I'll honor our agreement, provide the settlement. You'd be free, safe, away from all this. Do you want me to go? The question hung between them. Nathaniel set down his glass, turning to face her fully. What I want is irrelevant. I brought you into this knowing the risks to myself, but I never considered how thoroughly I'd be risking you as well. I'm not leaving. Margaret closed the distance between them, emboldened by darkness and fear and the desperate need to make him understand. Not because of our agreement or the settlement or any practical consideration. I'm staying because, she faltered, the truth too large for words. Because? His hands found her waist, pulling her closer. Because when I look at you, I don't see a tycoon or a business arrangement. I see a man who fought his way up from nothing, who seeks justice for his father, who treats me as an equal when the world expects you to treat me as property. I see someone worth standing beside, worth fighting for. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I see someone I'm beginning to... Nathaniel kissed her before she could finish, before she could speak aloud the terrifying truth her heart already knew. This kiss wasn't gentle or tentative like their first. It was fierce, desperate, full of fear and need and the acknowledgement that they had crossed a line from which there was no return. Margaret clung to him, her hands fisting in his shirt, her body pressed against his solid strength. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Nathaniel rested his forehead against hers. This changes everything, he said hoarsely. I know. Our arrangement is no longer merely an arrangement. Margaret's fingers traced the line of his jaw. Perhaps it never was. Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. After we deal with Whitmore, after this crisis passes, we need to discuss what this means, what we mean. Yes, Margaret kissed him again, softer this time. But for now, we focus on surviving the storm. They stood together in the darkened library, holding each other as though they could ward off the approaching danger through sheer force of will. Outside, the city slept, unaware that within one mansion on Fifth Avenue, 2 people who had agreed to pretend at marriage were discovering something far more dangerous, something real. The evening of Whitmore's gathering arrived too quickly. Margaret stood before her mirror while her maid arranged her hair, trying to calm the nervous flutter in her stomach. She had chosen a gown of deep sapphire that Nathaniel said made her eyes look like storm clouds, beautiful and dangerous. Dangerous was appropriate, Margaret thought. Tonight she would either secure their safety or condemn them both. Nathaniel appeared in the doorway, stunning in black evening dress. His eyes swept over her with undisguised appreciation. "You're breathtaking." And terrified," Margaret admitted once her maid had departed. He crossed to her, taking both her hands. "We can still abandon this plan. Find another way." "There is no other way. Whitmore will publish within days unless we stop him." Margaret squeezed his hands. "I can do this, Nathaniel. Trust me." "I do trust you. That's what terrifies me." He pulled her close, his lips brushing her temple. "If anything goes wrong, it won't. Davies will be watching, you'll keep Whitmore occupied, and I'll be quick." She pulled back to meet his eyes. "We're partners, remember? Equal in this venture." The carriage ride to Whitmore's mansion passed in tense silence. Davies had gone ahead separately, posing as a journalist invited to observe the gathering. Margaret reviewed the plan in her mind. Wait until the men retired to the smoking room after dinner, claim a headache requiring the powder room, slip away to Whitmore's study on the second floor, search for the documents, and return before her absence drew notice. Simple, foolproof, absolutely terrifying. Whitmore's home was aggressively opulent, all gilt and crystal and imported marble. The man himself greeted them with cold courtesy, his grey eyes lingering on Margaret with uncomfortable intensity. "Mrs. Blackwood, how lovely you look. Marriage clearly agrees with you. Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. You have a beautiful home, built on solid foundations, unlike some empires." His smile never reached his eyes. "Wouldn't you agree, Nathaniel?" "I agree that appearances can be deceiving," Nathaniel replied smoothly, his hand possessive at Margaret's waist. "Beautiful facades sometimes conceal rot beneath." The evening proceeded with excruciating slowness. Margaret found herself seated between a railroad investor with wandering hands and a politician who spoke only of tariffs. She smiled, nodded, contributed occasional observations, and waited. Finally, after dessert, Whitmore rose. "Gentlemen, shall we retire for cigars and brandy? Ladies, please make yourselves comfortable in the drawing room." As the men departed, Margaret lingered near the doorway, one hand pressed to her temple. Mrs. Whitmore, a nervous woman who seemed perpetually startled by her own existence, noticed immediately. "My dear, are you unwell?" "A slight headache. The heat, perhaps. Might I use your powder room?" "Of course. Up the stairs, third door on the left." Margaret climbed the stairs with measured steps, acutely aware of Davies' position near the entrance hall, reading a newspaper. At the landing she paused, confirming no servants were visible, then turned right instead of left. Whitmore's study door was locked, but Margaret had prepared for this. She withdrew a hairpin, her hands shaking as she worked the mechanism. Eleanor Prescott had taught her this skill years ago. A lady should know how to rescue herself from accidentally locked rooms, Eleanor had said with a wink. The lock clicked. Margaret slipped inside, closing the door behind her. The study was masculine and oppressive. Dark wood, heavy furniture, the smell of cigars and leather. A massive desk dominated the center, its surface neat as a military inspection. Margaret moved behind it, trying drawers systematically. All locked. More hairpins, more trembling fingers working metal mechanisms that seemed impossibly complex. The first drawer contained only correspondence, business letters, social invitations, nothing useful. The second held financial records that Margaret couldn't decipher quickly enough. The third drawer stuck. Margaret pulled harder, the wood protesting. Finally, it gave way with a crack that sounded impossibly loud in the silent room. Inside lay a leather portfolio tied with string. Margaret's heart hammered as she opened it, scanning the documents within. Contracts with forged signatures, Nathaniel's signatures, receipts for bribes, testimonies from workers willing to swear they'd witnessed Nathaniel's illegal activities. But something was wrong. The papers looked too new, the ink too fresh. Margaret held one to the lamplight, examining the signature. It was good, nearly perfect, but the pressure was too even. Nathaniel signed with distinctive variation, lighter at the beginning of strokes, heavier at the end. These weren't originals. They were forgeries. Whitmore had created false evidence to blackmail Nathaniel, probably planning to manufacture originals for publication once he'd extracted everything he wanted. Margaret began photographing the documents with the small camera Davies had provided, her hands moving quickly despite her fear. She had perhaps 5 minutes before her absence became suspicious. The study door opened. Margaret froze, the camera clutched in her hands as Thomas Whitmore stepped inside. His expression shifted from surprise to cold satisfaction. Well, the devoted wife turns out to be a thief. "I'm not stealing anything," Margaret forced her voice steady. "Merely documenting forgeries created to blackmail my husband." She held up one of the papers. "This signature is fake. You manufactured evidence because you couldn't find actual crimes to expose." Whitmore's smile was reptilian. A clever observation. "Unfortunately, by the time you explain that to anyone, you'll be arrested for breaking and entering, your reputation destroyed, and your husband bankrupt from legal fees defending you." He moved closer, blocking her path to the door. "Did you really think I wouldn't anticipate this? I've had men watching your house for weeks. When Davies left tonight, I knew exactly what you planned." Fear clawed at Margaret's throat. Nathaniel will do nothing. He's currently being entertained by a story about railroad expansion opportunities in the West. By the time he realizes you're missing, the police will have already arrived. Whitmore reached for the bell pull. "A shame, really. You're far too intelligent for him. With the right guidance, you could have been formidable." Before he could ring for servants, the study door burst open. Nathaniel entered like a storm, Davies behind him. "Step away from my wife." Whitmore's hand dropped from the bell pull. "This is my home, Blackwood. You have no authority here. And you have no legitimate evidence against me." Nathaniel moved to Margaret's side, his presence solid and protective. "Only forgeries you created yourself. We have photographs proving it now. Photographs that will never see the light of day once I have you both arrested." "For what?" Davies spoke for the first time, producing a notebook. "I'm a journalist, Mr. Whitmore. I've documented everything tonight. Your confession to forging evidence, your threats against Mrs. Blackwood, your admission of blackmail. Quite the story." Whitmore's composure cracked. "You have nothing. It's your word against mine." "Actually," a new voice said from the doorway, "it's considerably more than that." Vivian Ashford stepped into the study, her face pale but determined. Behind her stood a police inspector and 2 officers. "Miss Ashford." Whitmore's confusion was almost comical. "What are you doing?" "Ensuring I'm not destroyed alongside you." Vivian wouldn't meet Margaret's eyes. "Inspector Bradshaw, this is the man I told you about. Thomas Whitmore has been manufacturing evidence, attempting to blackmail Nathaniel Blackwood, and threatening violence against Mrs. Blackwood when she discovered his crimes." "That's absurd." Whitmore backed against his desk. "Vivian, we had an agreement until I realized you were planning to implicate me as well." Vivian's voice was ice. "I may be many things, Mr. Whitmore, but I'm not fool enough to commit crimes for a man who would happily sacrifice me to save himself." Inspector Bradshaw moved forward. "Thomas Whitmore, you're under arrest for attempted blackmail, forgery, and conspiracy." The next hour passed in chaos. Officers searched the study, confiscating documents. Whitmore was led away in handcuffs, protesting his innocence. The other guests emerged from various rooms, scandalized and thrilled by the drama. Through it all, Nathaniel's hand remained wrapped around Margaret's, anchoring her in the storm. Finally, they stood alone in Whitmore's entrance hall. Davies having departed with his explosive story, the guests dispersed to spread gossip. Only Vivian remained, standing awkwardly near the door. "Why did you help us?" Margaret asked. Vivian's laugh was bitter. "Help you? I helped myself. Whitmore kept insurance against everyone he worked with, evidence to implicate us if things went wrong. I found his files on me last week. Rather than wait for him to use them, I went to the police first. She finally met Margaret's gaze. Though I'll admit, seeing you stand up to him gave me courage. You're braver than I gave you credit for. What will you do now? Nathaniel asked. Leave New York. I have cousins in Boston who've been begging me to visit. A fresh start, away from this cesspool of manipulation and revenge. Vivian pulled on her gloves with jerky movements. For what it's worth, Mrs. Blackwood, you won him fairly. Treat him better than I would have. She departed before Margaret could respond, leaving them alone in the aftermath of the evening's drama. In the carriage home, Margaret finally allowed herself to collapse against Nathaniel, the fear and tension draining away to leave only exhaustion. You were magnificent, he murmured into her hair. Terrifying, but magnificent. I was terrified, Margaret laughed shakily. When Whitmore walked in, I thought everything was finished. So did I. When Davies signaled that you'd been discovered, I've never moved so fast. His arms tightened around her. Never again, Margaret. Never again do you risk yourself like that. Then I suppose you'll need to avoid acquiring new enemies. I'll try. He tilted her face up, his eyes searching hers in the dim carriage light. What you did tonight, the courage, the quick thinking, the absolute refusal to back down. I've never met anyone like you. Nathaniel, let me finish. His thumb traced her cheekbone. I brought you into this arrangement thinking I needed a decorative wife to improve my social standing. But what I needed was a partner, an equal, someone brave enough to face danger at my side, clever enough to outthink my enemies, and stubborn enough to refuse any option that involved abandoning me. His voice dropped to a whisper. Someone I could love. Margaret's breath caught. Love? I know it wasn't part of our agreement. I know we promised this would be temporary, practical, emotion-free. But Margaret, somewhere between our first meeting and tonight, I fell completely in love with you. He pressed his forehead to hers. I'm not asking you to return the feeling, but I needed you to know that whatever happens after our 2 years are complete, whatever you decide about our future, my heart is yours. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. You foolish man. Don't you know I fell in love with you weeks ago? I've been trying to convince myself it was merely gratitude or attraction or anything other than what it truly was. She cupped his face between her hands. I love you, Nathaniel Blackwood. Not your fortune or your mansion or your social position. You, the man who built an empire to avenge his father, who treats me as an equal, who makes me feel braver and stronger than I ever knew I could be. Nathaniel kissed her then, deep and tender and full of promise. Then perhaps we should renegotiate our arrangement. Perhaps we should. Margaret smiled against his lips. I'm thinking lifetime terms instead of 2 years. With considerably more affection and significantly fewer separate bedrooms. I believe those terms are acceptable. His hands tangled in her hair, scattering pins to the carriage floor. More than acceptable. Perfect. They arrived home to find the staff discreetly absent, candles lit throughout the house. Margaret led Nathaniel upstairs, not to her room or his, but to the future they would build together, no longer a business arrangement, but a true marriage forged in danger and tested by fire. As they crossed the threshold together, Margaret understood that she had gained something far more valuable than the independence she'd originally sought. She had found partnership, passion, and purpose. She had found love. Margaret woke in Nathaniel's arms to sunlight streaming through windows she didn't recognize. His bedroom, she realized, where they'd fallen asleep after hours of whispered confessions and tender exploration. She had never imagined such intimacy was possible, not just physical but emotional, the complete dissolution of walls they'd both spent years constructing. Nathaniel stirred, his eyes opening to find her watching him. Good morning, Mrs. Blackwood. Good morning, husband. The word felt different now, weighted with truth rather than pretense. He pulled her close, kissing her thoroughly. I could grow accustomed to waking like this. You'll have to. Margaret traced the scar above his eyebrow. I'm rather done with separate bedrooms and pretending indifference. Before Nathaniel could respond, urgent knocking shattered the morning peace. Mrs. Morrison's voice carried through the door, higher pitched than Margaret had ever heard it. "Mr. Blackwood, sir, you must come immediately." Nathaniel grabbed his robe, opening the door only wide enough to speak. "What's happened?" "The morning papers, sir. You need to see them." 10 minutes later, Margaret and Nathaniel sat in his study, newspapers spread across the desk. The headlines screamed scandal in bold type. Railroad tycoon's wife, caught in blackmail plot, society questions. Blackwood marriage, convenience or conspiracy. Whitmore arrested, but questions remain about Blackwood's past. The articles were devastating. While they reported Whitmore's arrest accurately, they raised pointed questions about why Margaret had been in his study, why she possessed burglary tools, whether the Blackwood marriage was itself a conspiracy to manipulate investors and society. Anonymous sources claimed the marriage was a sham, that Margaret was complicit in Nathaniel's alleged crimes, that both had fabricated the forgery evidence to frame an innocent man. "This is impossible." Margaret scanned article after article, each more damning than the last. "How could they turn our victory into a scandal?" "Whitmore has friends in the press." Nathaniel's voice was hollow. "Powerful friends who owe him favors. Even from a cell he can destroy us." A knock at the door heralded Davies, the investigator, looking haggard. "Have you seen the papers?" "All of them." Nathaniel gestured to the desk. "How bad is it?" "Bad. The Union Club has already received petitions to revoke your membership. 3 investors have withdrawn from the Montana expansion, and—" Davies hesitated. "Cornelius Vandermeer has called an emergency meeting of the Social Arbitration Committee for tonight. They'll decide whether you and Mrs. Blackwood remain acceptable in polite society." Margaret felt the blood drain from her face. Social ruin meant more than hurt feelings. It meant business partnerships dissolved, political support vanished, Nathaniel's empire crumbling. "What can we do?" she asked. "Tell the truth." Nathaniel stood, his jaw set with determination. "We attend Vandermeer's meeting and lay everything bare. My past mistakes, Whitmore's forgeries, Vivian's cooperation. We answer every question with complete honesty and hope that integrity counts for something. And if it doesn't," his hand found hers, "then we face ruin together." The hours before the meeting passed in preparation. Nathaniel reviewed financial documents proving his company's legitimacy. Davies gathered sworn statements from workers attesting to improved safety conditions. Margaret penned a detailed account of the previous evening's events, her hand cramping from writing. As they dressed for the meeting, Margaret caught Nathaniel's reflection in her mirror. He looked older than he had weeks ago, the strain evident in new lines around his eyes. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "I don't regret any of it. Not the marriage, not helping you, not falling in love." He crossed to her, gathering her close. "If I lose everything else, I'll still have you. That's enough. It's more than enough. It's everything." Vandermeer's home had been transformed into a tribunal. The drawing room held 12 chairs arranged in a semicircle, the most powerful voices in New York society seated in judgment. Cornelius presided at the center, his wife to his right. Margaret recognized railroad investors, banking magnates, old money patriarchs whose ancestors had arrived on the Mayflower. She and Nathaniel sat facing them, defendants awaiting verdict. "This committee has convened," Cornelius began, his voice grave, "to address serious questions regarding the character and conduct of Nathaniel Blackwood and his wife, Margaret. The newspapers have made serious allegations. Before we render judgment, we will hear from the accused." Nathaniel stood, his posture erect, voice steady. "I won't insult this committee with denials or excuses. Instead, I'll tell you a story, not a pleasant one, but true." He spoke for 20 minutes, laying bare his origins, his father's death, his questionable early business practices. He omitted nothing, explained everything, and concluded with unwavering conviction. "I'm not the man I was 15 years ago. I've built legitimate businesses, improved working conditions, created opportunities for thousands. But I can't erase my past mistakes. If this committee decides those mistakes disqualify me from your society, I'll accept that judgment. But I will not accept accusations that my wife participated in any wrongdoing. Margaret knew nothing of my past until recently. Her only crime was showing loyalty when she could have walked away. He sat. Silence filled the room. Then Margaret stood, her legs trembling but voice clear. "May I speak?" Mrs. Vandermeer nodded permission. "I married Nathaniel Blackwood knowing it was an arrangement of convenience. I was destitute, desperate, and he offered rescue. Society may judge that transaction harshly, but I won't apologize for choosing survival over starvation." Margaret's gaze swept the assembled judges. "What I will address is the accusation that our marriage is a sham designed to manipulate you." She moved to stand beside Nathaniel, her hand finding his. "Our marriage began as a business arrangement. That's true. But it became something genuine, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared values, and eventually love. When I discovered Thomas Whitmore was using forged documents to blackmail my husband, I chose to help not because I was complicit in crimes, but because I believe in justice, because I'd seen firsthand the man Nathaniel has become, not just the mistakes he once made." Her voice strengthened, passion overriding fear. "You sit in judgment tonight, asking whether we're worthy of your society. But I question whether your society is worthy of people who fight for what's right, who acknowledge past mistakes and strive to correct them, who choose integrity over convenience." Nathaniel could have paid Whitmore's blackmail. It would have been easier, safer, less scandalous. He refused because it was wrong. I helped him because standing beside my husband when he makes the right choice is exactly what a wife should do. Margaret paused, meeting each judge's eyes in turn. "If you decide we're too tainted by scandal, too controversial to tolerate, then we'll leave this society without regret. But we'll leave together, with our integrity intact and our love uncompromised. That's worth more than all your approval combined." She sat, her heart pounding, Nathaniel's hand gripping hers so tightly her fingers ached. Cornelius Vandermeer cleared his throat. "The committee will deliberate privately. You'll wait in the library." The next hour was agony. Margaret and Nathaniel sat in silence, hands intertwined, preparing themselves for exile. Davies had promised to help them relocate if necessary, perhaps to San Francisco or Chicago, cities where New York's social judgment carried less weight. "Wherever we go," Nathaniel said quietly, "we'll build something new. Together." "Together," Margaret agreed. Finally, the library door opened. Cornelius entered alone, his expression unreadable. Margaret's stomach clenched. "The committee has reached a decision." He paused, his shrewd eyes studying them. "We find that while Mr. Blackwood's early business practices were questionable, his subsequent years of legitimate enterprise and improved worker welfare demonstrate genuine reform. We find that Mrs. Blackwood acted with remarkable courage and loyalty, qualities we value highly in our community. And we find," his stern expression cracked into a smile, "that any couple who loves each other enough to face social ruin together deserves support, not condemnation." Margaret gasped. Nathaniel's hand tightened on hers. "You're accepting us," she whispered. "We're doing more than that." Cornelius moved closer. "The committee will issue a formal statement tomorrow endorsing the Blackwood marriage and condemning the newspaper articles as sensationalist garbage. We'll make it clear that anyone who continues to question your legitimacy will answer to us." "Why?" Nathaniel's voice was hoarse with disbelief. "After everything." "Because Mrs. Vandermeer reminded us that the greatest families in New York started with men who took risks, made mistakes, and built empires through determination and intelligence. Your great-grandfathers were no more saints than you, Blackwood. They simply had the advantage of time to bury their indiscretions." Cornelius extended his hand. "Welcome officially to society, both of you. Though after that speech, Margaret, I suspect you'll be reforming us rather than the reverse." As they left Vandermeer's home, stepping into the cool night air, Margaret felt lighter than she had in weeks. The storm had broken, and they had survived it together. In the carriage, Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. "I can't believe it's over." "Not over. Beginning." Margaret tilted her face up to kiss him. "Everything before was prologue. This is where our real story starts. Then I can't wait to see what happens next." Neither could Margaret. For a woman who had once faced life as a penniless spinster, who had accepted a loveless arrangement out of desperation, she had somehow found herself in possession of the one thing she'd never dared hope for: a true partnership, a genuine love, a future bright with possibility, and a husband who looked at her like she was worth more than all his empire's gold. Spring arrived in New York, with the subtle violence of nature reclaiming stone and steel. In the gardens of the Blackwood mansion, cherry trees exploded into bloom, petals drifting like snow across perfectly manicured lawns. Margaret stood at her bedroom window. Their bedroom now, she corrected herself with a smile, watching Nathaniel speak with the head gardener about expanding the rose beds. 6 months had passed since the night they'd faced social judgment and emerged victorious. 6 months of rebuilding, of learning to be truly married rather than playing roles. Some days were harder than others. Old habits of independence and emotional guardedness didn't disappear overnight. But every morning they woke together, and every night they fell asleep in each other's arms. And slowly, they were building something neither had believed possible: a real marriage, a true partnership, a love that deepened with each passing day. Mrs. Blackwood, her maid, Sarah, appeared in the doorway. "Mrs. Prescott has arrived for tea." Margaret smiled. Eleanor had become a regular visitor, her sharp wit and unconditional support a constant source of comfort. "Show her to the conservatory, please. I'll join her momentarily." 20 minutes later, Margaret found Eleanor settled among the ferns and orchids, looking entirely at home in her outdated but beautifully maintained gown. "You're glowing," Eleanor announced without preamble. "Marriage clearly agrees with you, or is there another reason for that particular glow?" Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I don't know what you mean." "Don't dissemble with me, child. I've known you since you were 10 years old. You're with child, aren't you?" There was no hiding anything from Eleanor. Margaret sank into the chair opposite her friend, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. 2 months. We haven't told anyone yet. It's so early, and after everything that's happened. You're afraid something will go wrong." Eleanor reached across to pat Margaret's hand. "Perfectly natural. But you're young, healthy, and clearly very much in love with your husband. That child will be fine. How did you know? About the love, I mean." "Because you look at each other the way my late husband and I did, like the rest of the world could burn and you'd barely notice as long as you had each other." Eleanor's eyes misted. "That's rare, Margaret. Treasure it." "I do. Every day." Margaret poured tea with steady hands. "Though I'll admit sometimes I still can't believe how everything turned out. 6 months ago I was preparing to lose everything. Now I have a home, security, purpose, and a husband I actually love. It feels almost too good to be real." "Then stop waiting for catastrophe and enjoy your happiness." Eleanor accepted her teacup. "Though, speaking of happiness, have you heard about Vivian Ashford?" "Not since she left for Boston." "Why?" "She's engaged to a very wealthy, very boring banker who apparently adores her. My sources say she's genuinely trying to reform herself, fewer social machinations, more charity work." Eleanor smiled wryly. "Perhaps your example inspired her." Margaret doubted that, but she was glad Vivian had found some measure of peace. "And Thomas Whitmore, sentenced to 5 years for blackmail and forgery, his business empire has been divided among various creditors, a fitting end for a man who built on fraud and exploitation." They chatted for another hour, Eleanor filling Margaret in on society gossip, Margaret sharing plans for Nathaniel's new charitable foundation dedicated to improving railroad safety. When Eleanor finally departed, Margaret felt centered, grateful for the constancy of true friendship. She found Nathaniel in his study, reviewing contracts. He looked up when she entered, his entire face transforming with a smile that still made her heart skip. "You look happy," he observed, setting aside his work. "I am happy." Eleanor visited. We talked. She guessed about the baby. Nathaniel was at her side instantly, his hands cradling her face. "Are you upset that she knows?" "No. Eleanor will keep the secret until we're ready to announce, and it felt good to share the news with someone." Margaret covered his hands with hers. "We should tell your mother soon. She deserves to know she'll be a grandmother." Nathaniel's mother lived in a comfortable house Nathaniel had purchased for her, finally retired from the grueling factory work that had sustained them after his father's death. She had welcomed Margaret with tearful gratitude, thanking her for making her son happy. "We'll visit her this weekend," Nathaniel agreed. "She'll be thrilled. Probably start knitting immediately." Margaret laughed, imagining the tiny, fierce woman who had raised Nathaniel surrounded by yarn and baby clothes. "I'd like that." Nathaniel pulled her into his arms, his hand splaying across her stomach where their child grew. "I never imagined I could have this. A family, a wife who loves me not for my money but for who I am. A future that looks like more than just business and revenge." "You deserve all of it." Margaret kissed him softly. "You've worked for every good thing you have." "We worked for it." His arms tightened around her. "You saved me, Margaret. Not just from Whitmore, but from myself, from becoming so consumed by ambition and old grievances that I forgot what truly matters." "What truly matters?" "This." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "You, me, the family we're building, the life we're creating together. That's the real fortune I've built." That evening, they hosted a dinner for Nathaniel's business partners and their wives, an event that 6 months ago would have filled Margaret with dread. Now she moved through the preparations with confidence, arranging seating, directing servants, greeting guests with genuine warmth. During the meal, Cornelius Vandermeer raised his glass in a toast. "To the Blackwoods, proof that love and integrity matter more than lineage or fortune. You've set a new standard for what marriage and partnership should be." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes as glasses clinked around the table. Nathaniel's hand found hers beneath the table, squeezing gently. After the guests departed, they stood together on the balcony overlooking Fifth Avenue. The city glittered below them, gaslight and ambition made visible. "Do you ever regret it?" Nathaniel asked quietly. "Giving up your independence for this?" Margaret turned to face him, framing his beloved face with her hands. "I didn't give up independence. I traded solitary struggle for shared strength. That's not loss, it's multiplication." She smiled. "Besides, I'm probably the most independently minded wife on Fifth Avenue. You haven't domesticated me yet." "I wouldn't dare try." He kissed her tenderly. "Your fierce independence is one of the things I love most about you." "Good. Because I'm planning to use it. I've been thinking about Eleanor's comments, about charity work. I want to start a school for working-class girls, teaching them skills beyond factory work, giving them options my mother never had." "That's brilliant!" Nathaniel's eyes lit with enthusiasm. "We could fund it through the foundation, provide scholarships, perhaps even apprenticeships with respectable businesses. We could change lives." Margaret's mind raced with possibilities. "Give girls the education and opportunities I took for granted. Then we'll do it, together." He pulled her close, his chin resting on her head. "Everything together, from now on." 3 months later, Margaret stood before a modest building in Lower Manhattan, freshly painted, windows sparkling, a sign reading "The Thornton School for Girls" mounted above the door. Nathaniel had insisted on naming it after her family, honoring the education and values her parents had given her. 20 girls from the surrounding tenements had enrolled, their faces bright with hope and hunger for knowledge. Margaret would teach literature and history, while other instructors covered mathematics, practical skills, and business fundamentals. As she rang the bell to begin the first day of classes, Margaret felt a sense of purpose deeper than anything she'd experienced in her previous life. This was what she'd been meant to do. Not simply survive, but thrive and help others do the same. That evening, exhausted but exhilarated, she returned home to find Nathaniel waiting with a bouquet of roses and a smile. "How was the first day?" "Perfect. Challenging. Everything I hoped." Margaret accepted the flowers, burying her nose in their fragrance. "Thank you for making this possible. Thank you for showing me there's more to life than revenge and accumulation." He drew her close, his hand resting on her now visible pregnancy. "You've taught me that true wealth isn't measured in gold, but in love, purpose, and the lives we touch." Such philosophical observations from a railroad tycoon. Such impertinence from a woman who once agreed to a loveless marriage of convenience. They laughed together, the sound echoing through their home, a home that had once felt like a museum of wealth, but now felt lived in, loved, genuinely theirs. In bed that night, Nathaniel's arms wrapped protectively around her, Margaret reflected on the impossible journey that had brought her here. She had entered his life as a commodity, a business transaction, a solution to a problem. She remained as his partner, his equal, his love. The arrangement that should have ended after 2 years stretched forward now into a lifetime, not because of contracts or obligations, but because they had chosen each other again and again, through every trial and triumph. "I love you," Nathaniel murmured into the darkness, his voice heavy with approaching sleep. "I love you," Margaret replied, her hand covering his where it rested on their child. And in that moment, in that truth, she understood that some fortunes couldn't be inherited or accumulated. The greatest wealth came from giving your heart to someone brave enough to treasure it, from building something real in a world of facades, from choosing love when every practical consideration suggested otherwise. She had been nobody's choice as a wife until Nathaniel Blackwood came to her door with his impossible proposition. Now she was his choice every day, as he was hers. And that, Margaret thought as sleep claimed her, was worth more than all the mansions on Fifth Avenue combined. New York City, spring 1893. 10 years later, the Thornton School for Girls had outgrown its original building twice. Now it occupied an entire block in Lower Manhattan, 3 stories of brick and hope, where over 200 girls received education that would have been unimaginable to their mothers. Margaret Blackwood stood in the 3rd-floor hallway, watching through the classroom window as her eldest daughter, Catherine, age 8, solved a mathematics problem at the blackboard. The girl had inherited her father's head for numbers and her mother's stubborn determination, a formidable combination. "She'll run the railroad someday," a warm voice said behind her. Margaret turned to find Nathaniel, silver threading more prominently through his dark hair now, his face showing the comfortable lines of a man who had learned to smile frequently. Their son, Patrick, named for Nathaniel's father, rode on his shoulders, sticky hands tangled in his father's hair. "Down, Papa! Want Mama!" Nathaniel swung the 5-year-old down, and Patrick immediately attached himself to Margaret's skirts, chattering about the horse he'd seen on their walk. "How was the board meeting?" Margaret asked, running her fingers through Patrick's unruly curls. "Productive. We've approved funding for 3 new schools, one in Boston, one in Philadelphia, one in Chicago. Your educational empire is expanding, Mrs. Blackwood." "Our empire," she corrected. "I merely teach. You provide the resources that make it possible." "A partnership, then, as everything has been." The classroom door opened, and Catherine emerged, spotting her parents immediately. "Mama, I finished all my lessons early. Miss Williams says I can help the younger girls with their reading if I want." "That's wonderful, sweetheart." Margaret hugged her daughter, marveling as always at this fierce, intelligent creature she and Nathaniel had created. "What do you say we all go home for tea? Your grandmother is visiting." The walk to their carriage took them past streets Margaret recognized from a different lifetime. The neighborhood where she'd once struggled to survive on the scraps of her family's former fortune. The buildings looked smaller now, shabbier, and she felt a surge of gratitude for the circumstances that had lifted her from that desperation. At home, Nathaniel's mother waited in the conservatory, her once work-roughened hands now gentle as she helped their youngest daughter, 2-year-old Eleanor, water the plants. The sight of 3 generations together made Margaret's chest tighten with emotion. Later, after the children had been fed and sent to the nursery, Margaret and Nathaniel stood in the library, the room where they'd shared their first kiss, where they'd planned Whitmore's downfall, where so many crucial conversations had taken place. "Do you ever think about that first night?" Margaret asked, leaning into her husband's embrace. "When you knocked on my door with your impossible proposition?" "Every day." Nathaniel's arms tightened around her. "I thought I was hiring an asset. I had no idea I was meeting my future. I thought I was selling my dignity for survival. I didn't understand I was finding my purpose." We were both wrong about what we needed, and both right about what we wanted, even if we didn't know it yet. Nathaniel turned her in his arms, his expression tender. "If I could go back to that desperate man planning a marriage of convenience, I'd tell him to forget the plan, to simply ask you to take a chance on him, on love, on building something real together. If you could go back to that desperate woman counting pennies, I'd tell her not to be afraid. That choosing partnership over pride, vulnerability over protection, would lead to more happiness than she'd ever imagined possible." "No regrets?" "Only one." Margaret smiled up at him. "I regret every day we wasted pretending indifference when we could have been loving each other honestly." "Then let's not waste another moment." He kissed her with the passion of newlyweds and the deep knowledge of long partnership, a perfect combination that still made Margaret's heart race after 10 years of marriage. They were interrupted by Catherine's voice calling from the hallway, some urgent childhood crisis requiring parental intervention. Margaret and Nathaniel shared a knowing look, the kind that passed between couples who had weathered storms and celebrated triumphs, who had built not just a marriage, but a life. As they moved together toward the sound of their children's voices, Margaret thought about the girl she'd been, proud, frightened, alone, and the woman she'd become. She had feared that accepting Nathaniel's arrangement meant surrendering her independence. Instead, she'd learned that true independence wasn't solitary strength, but the freedom to choose your own path, your own partner, your own purpose. She had chosen love when practicality suggested otherwise. She had chosen risk when safety beckoned. She had chosen Nathaniel Blackwood, not because she needed rescuing, but because together they could build something neither could create alone. The railroad tycoon had indeed brought her to his Fifth Avenue mansion. But she had brought him something far more valuable, a home filled with love, laughter, and the knowledge that the greatest fortunes are built not of gold and steel, but of trust, partnership, and devotion freely given. In the nursery, surrounded by their children and Nathaniel's mother, Margaret caught her husband's eye across the room. He smiled, and she smiled back, a private communication that needed no words. No one had wanted her as a wife until Nathaniel Blackwood came to her door. Now she was wanted, loved, cherished every day, and that, she thought as Eleanor climbed into her lap and Patrick began telling a fantastical story about dragons, was the greatest triumph of all. Not surviving, but thriving. Not enduring, but flourishing. Not settling for what was offered, but choosing what truly mattered. Love, family, purpose, partnership, everything she dreamed of, and so much more than she dared hope for. And so ends the remarkable journey of Margaret and Nathaniel Blackwood, two souls who found each other in the gilded cage of 19th century New York society and discovered that true wealth has nothing to do with Fifth Avenue mansions or railroad empires. Their story reminds us that sometimes our greatest blessings arrive disguised as desperate circumstances. Margaret believed she was sacrificing her principles for survival when she accepted Nathaniel's proposition. In truth, She was stepping through a door into a future more magnificent than she'd ever imagined. Nathaniel thought he was purchasing social respectability. Instead, he found a partner who would stand beside him through scandal and triumph, who would challenge him to become better than he dreamed possible. Their love teaches us that vulnerability is not weakness, but courage. That true partnership means facing storms together rather than weathering them alone. That the best marriages are built not on convenience or calculation, but on mutual respect, shared values, and the daily choice to love even when circumstances make it difficult. As we close this chapter on their story, I invite you to reflect. What impossible propositions have appeared in your own life that might actually be doorways to destiny? When have you chosen vulnerability over protection and found it led to your greatest joy? If this tale of love conquering pride, partnership overcoming adversity, and two hearts finding each other against all odds resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please take a moment to comment below and share what touched you most about Margaret and Nathaniel's journey. And if you stayed with them from that first desperate meeting through to their triumphant happily ever after, write the word triumph in the comments. I'd love to know who traveled this entire emotional journey with me. Be sure to explore the other romantic tales I've shared, each one a different glimpse into the power of love to transform, heal, and triumph over every obstacle. Whether your heart beats for historical romance, contemporary love stories, or tales from different eras entirely, there's a story waiting to sweep you away. Thank you for spending this time in the Gilded Age with Margaret and Nathaniel. May their love inspire you to take chances, choose partnership, and never underestimate the transformative power of opening your heart to possibility. Until our next romantic journey together.